Hello, this is Chris Browder, and this is video 2.2. And this is part two in a series that's an historical overview of SLA theories. We're going to be moving into, I guess, what you would call contemporary SLA theories today. So let's see. This video, like most of my videos, is largely based on Rod Ellis's book called Understanding Second Language Acquisition and Lightbound and Spotted text, How Languages Are Learned. So as you may know, in the last video, we talked about what you would call early theories of second language acquisition. We talked about innatism, constructivism, and behaviorism. So, as you may know, innatists believed that language learning was different from other types of human learning. They believed that children have some special innate ability to learn languages. Innatism was a theory about first language acquisition, but like most language acquisition theories from linguistics, it was eventually applied to understand second language learning. Some people hope to find a way for adults to tap into this special innate capacity for language learning that children have. You may also recall that constructivists like Piaget and Vygotsky believed humans learned by constructing systems of knowledge in their minds. Behaviorists, in contrast, were not interested in speculating about innate abilities or what was going on in people's minds. They were instead determined to understand human learning only by studying measurable changes in behavior. They believed second language learning was a process of imitation, conditioning, and habit formation, stimulus and response, rewards and punishments. They did not believe humans were really learning grammar rules or really their thinking. They were just imitating examples and building habits. The behaviorist school of thought dominated research on language learning and teaching in the 1950s and 60s. But their own research, was really not very successful in validating their own theories or informing effective approaches to teaching. And eventually, researchers started looking elsewhere for ideas. The search for answers outside of behaviorism led to a resurgence of interest in ideas such as innatism and constructivism. Like, in other words, a comeback. People began to refer to these other schools of thought as cognitivism because, in contrast to behaviorism, these researchers were interested in understanding what was happening in the minds of learners, or what they called cognition, the thinking, the processing, the rule learning, the construction of knowledge that goes on inside the human mind that you can't see and you really can't objectively study, or at least you couldn't back then. In 1958, a researcher named Jean Burko challenged all the major premises of behaviorism with one very simple study. In her study, she would simply show pictures of imaginary creatures to children and ask them questions, basically like a conversation almost, or a game, or having fun, or playing with the language. Burko, for instance, would show a child a picture of an imaginary creature and tell the child it was called a wug. Then she would show the child a picture of two of those creatures and ask the child, "What are these?" And the child would answer, "Those are wugs." In this study, she showed that children learned to follow grammar rules and then used those rules to understand and comprehend utterances that they had never heard before. The word wugs, for example, could not have been imitation, conditioning, and habit formation because the child had only heard wug and had somehow invented the plural form of the word, which is wugs. Burko's simple study validated claims from constructivists that humans learned by building systems of knowledge in their minds instead of just imitating. 1 year later, Noam Chomsky wrote an article arguing that children have some special ability to learn languages. He referred to this ability as a language acquisition device, or LAD. Chomsky explained that languages are extremely complicated systems of rules. So complicated that people using those languages are just generally not aware of how many rules there are and how complicated those rules are, how many exceptions there are to each one of those rules. Yet, children manage to learn those rules at an age at which they're not normally capable of learning other complicated rule governed subjects like math. So they're not capable of learning rules yet. They are learning language rules. Children master those grammar rules by the age of 7, but they can't tell you what those rules are. They seem to be unaware of the rules that they're following. And most adults, who are also generally very unaware of the rules of their own languages, they don't correct children when they're making these grammar mistakes. They, of course, they might correct children once in a while, but generally they're not capable of correcting children's grammar errors because they don't know what the correct rules are. They kind of have a feeling for it, right? But with or without grammar correction, children are still learning correct grammar. Eventually, they're learning to correct themselves without much help from the adults. So, this revolution in first language acquisition theory and research inspired a revolution in second language acquisition research and theory. And this revolution was the start of what I could call contemporary SLA. Larry Selinger, for example, applied the cognitivist and constructivist ideas of Burko and Piaget by proposing second language learners are gradually constructing and revising a personalized system of language rules inside their minds. In other words, each language learner is kind of building their own unique version of the second language inside their minds. And he called this internal learner language an interlanguage because it starts off being based largely on the rules of the first language, but gradually becomes more similar to the second language as the learner learns more of those L2 rules. So it's a transitional language or an in-between language. That's why he called it an interlanguage. Inspired by Salinger, DeLay and Burt set out to understand how second language learners construct these interlanguages by conducting experiments similar to the experiments that were conducted by Jean Burko. DeLay and Burt interviewed adults learning English as a second language and analyzed their use of grammar during spontaneous speaking. This is important here. Spontaneous speaking, they believed, was an actual demonstration of real interlanguage as opposed to grammar tests or worksheets or something like that. They discovered that second language learners' errors could often not be explained by first language interference, as the behaviorists like Skinner insisted. Remember, Skinner, the behaviorist, insisted that all errors in the second language were the result of first language rules being incorrectly applied. So, for example, a person learning English past tense might say, I sitted on the chair. In this case, the learner was making a mistake because he was incorrectly applying a rule from the target language, not the learner's first language. This specific example is what we would call an overgeneralization, an error caused by overgeneralization, or an overgeneralization error. The learner learned to add the ed morpheme from past tense verbs, but applied the ed when she should have instead used an irregular verb. In other words, she said sitted instead of sat. This is not first language interference. In fact, all people learn English go through stages in which they make this type of mistake, regardless of their first language. Regardless of whether their first language is Korean or German, they're going to make this mistake at some point or another. In fact, interestingly, children, when they're learning their first language, also make this kind of mistake. This is clearly not imitation. This is creativity, or what Chomsky would call generative grammar, albeit incorrect creativity or incorrect generativity. DeLay and Burt also discovered that people generally acquire English grammar rules in a predictable order. So once again, remember this is studying spontaneous speech. This order is generally unaffected by their first language or even the order in which they're taught those grammar rules in the first place. For instance, learners typically learned to use the ing ending to make words like walking before they learned to use the ed ending to make words like walked. And regardless of first language or grammar instruction, the third person singular S ending, like what you have in walks, usually comes last. This concept has been referred to as the natural order of acquisition. This is the quintessential application of constructivism and cognitivism to SLA because it argues that learners are constructing systems of knowledge in their minds. New learning is built on a foundation of previous learning, and learning happens in predictable stages. In 1977, Stephen Krashen introduced one of the most significant SLA theories of all time. This theory is called the input hypothesis. In the input hypothesis, Krashen proposed that second language acquisition happens as a result of comprehensible input. He argued that adults, like children, also have a language acquisition device and could learn simply by listening to a language as long as that target language input was somehow made comprehensible. According to Krashen, second language learners would be more successful if language instruction focused on providing more comprehensible input that was challenging yet interesting and not stressful or frustrating. He argued that grammar instruction did not help learners acquire real competence in the language. In other words, giving learners knowledge of grammar rules would not help them actually use the language for real speaking and listening or communication. In fact, he even went as far as to insist that real second language acquisition was totally all about unconscious learning. As you can see, Krashen takes the research from DeLay and Burt to make the following chain of arguments. Number one, grammar learning follows a natural order. Number two, the natural order cannot be changed by grammar instruction. Number three, therefore grammar instruction is useless. Number four, grammar instruction creates explicit knowledge. Number five, therefore, explicit knowledge is useless. Number six, therefore, all second language acquisition is implicit or unconscious knowledge that's gained through immersion in second language input. And I guess that brings us to the last part. Number seven, all of this kind of magically happens because of the language acquisition device. Well, as you will see in later videos, much of the SLA research since 1977 has basically been a response to Krashen and his claims. We've basically spent the last 45 years either trying to prove these claims false or trying to prove they are true. Well, I hope this video was useful to you. All right, thanks a lot. Goodbye.